Good morning. My name is Jen Lee, and I'm here with the News Lab. We are doing our second of four Google Trends office hours today. Last week we did a Google Trends office hour specifically on how to use Google Trends, how to use our Explore page and find your own data. Today we'll be having a conversation specifically around data visualization. And then next Thursday we'll also be going deeper into what other tools you can be using. I have with me Nicholas Whitaker, who's also with the Google News Lab. If there are any resources that you're interested in specifically around the News Lab, check out newslab.withgoogle.com or Twitter at Google News Lab. We also have with us today Alberto Cairo, who is a data visualization expert. He's been at the University of Miami. Alberto, do you want to give a few words?
Yes, well, thanks for having me in the first place. Yes, I teach at the University of Miami. I have been here for 4 years, almost 5 years now, and but I also have a relatively long career in the news industry, working with infographics and data visualization, etc., for several media organizations in Spain and Brazil and in the US. I have also written a couple of books about infographics and data visualization, the functional art and the truthful art. And I also do visualization for a living. So besides teaching how to create them, I also create them myself. So I am also a graphic designer. And I don't know, I have a lot of fun working on this field.
We're really excited to have you, Alberto. And actually, if you we'll add the links to your books as well in the description of the Hangout and the YouTube video. So if those are who are interested, finding out a little bit more about what Alberto works on, definitely check those out.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Always really excited to help spread good knowledge or good information. And Alberto is one of the go-to folks for this. Also, just for everybody that's watching, we have a Q&A app feature that's available with this Hangout and with this office hour today. So if you have questions during the Hangout, definitely add your questions into the Q&A app there or into the comments of the YouTube section. And we'll be able to answer those questions live during the office hour. If you're watching this on a replay, the answers should be addressed throughout the entire Hangout. If there's links that we mentioned throughout the Hangout, those will be listed in the description of the video. And then next week, I just wanted to give you a heads up, we're going to have a guest, Frank Bai, who will be here to talk in a little bit more detail about things like fusion tables and how to integrate other tools into Google products. So Jen, tell us a little bit, what are we going to be covering today?
Yeah, so today we'll be talking about a lot of different data visualization that we've done with the Google News Lab with Google Trends. Everything from the more simplistic, like a line graph or donut charts, to some of the more beautiful visualizations that we've worked on that's taken us a bit more thought and time. We'll talk about kind of what inspired us to make these visualizations and how what our thought process was as we were developing them, and also just hear Alberto's expertise and advice on how to think about these problems when we're coming up with them and how we visualize these different ideas, going from spreadsheets to these beautiful interactives.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and get started then.
Yeah, cool. So, Alberto, do you want to present that first circular timeline?
Yeah, well, yeah. Prior to this conversation, just for people who are attending to know, we were talking about several graphics produced for the Google News Lab, for Google Trends and stuff. And full disclosure, it's very important for people to remember this. I am working as a consultant for that group. So this is important because it's part of the conversation. I'm working with you all, I'm working with Simon, giving my opinion about the visualizations that Google Trends produces. And I am a pretty opinionated person, so I have opinions about all graphics that I see. I always find room for improvement in any visualization, and that includes my own visualization. So there's no perfect visualization. There's an article that was published today by Steve Wexler that I tweeted recently, that says that there's no perfect visualization. That is absolutely true. There's no visualization that is perfect, but there's always room for improvement. There is always a way to find graphics that are more appropriate or less appropriate to representing the data at hand. What I usually say is that any good graphic that is intended to be presented to a broad audience needs to find a good balance between being attractive, being effective, and being clear. And those three things are extremely important when you are designing a visualization. If you produce a graphic that is only effective, then it will not be attractive. Therefore, nobody's going to read it. But if you produce a graphic that is very attractive but no effective at all, what you're doing is attracting people's attention to something that will finally not deliver. Therefore, you need to find some sort of balance between those three things. And it's a very hard task, but it's part of the fun of data visualization, right? So one of the graphics that we were commenting about, I'm actually going to share my screen right now, that we were commenting about before the conversation began was, let me just share my screen here. All right, so there was this graphic about how the world searched for terror attacks, and this was done by Anne Vital, and I will recommend that you visit her website. Her name is down here. You can just Google her and find her a website. She has produced some wonderful posters and infographics throughout the years. Her work is really, really good. And she did this graphic about how long it took in different countries to start searching for different terrorist attacks, right? Like, for example, the Brussels terrorist attacks, it took like 3 hours and 56 minutes from people in Sao Paulo to start searching for information about that attack. When I first saw this graphic, I thought that it was a very engaging, very interesting, very beautiful. It's very elegant. It's very well designed. It's fun to look at, right? It's I don't know. It's very, very well designed, right? But it has certain things that I believe could be improved. And I'm going to give you just an example of what I mean. I took a screenshot of the graphic in order to clarify what I mean. Take a look at that. This is what happens when you click on Toronto. You go here, you click on Toronto, and the lines of Toronto will be highlighted on the graphic. So I'm going to just zoom into those lines. The problem with circular shapes in visualization is sometimes they heavily distort the proportions of the data. And this is a perfect example of that. Take a look at that. In the case of Brussels, people from Toronto started searching for Brussels-related information after 51 minutes. And then Lahore, it took them 1 hour and 45 minutes. And in Istanbul, 1 hour and 27 minutes. Well, if you don't read the numbers, it looks like the line for 1 hour and 27 minutes is almost as long as the line for 51 minutes, when this is actually much longer than that. What is the problem? That the line for Istanbul is closer to the center of the circle. Therefore, it needs to be necessarily smaller than this other line that is on the outmost ring of the visualization. And even worse, if you go down here to this line here is representing 3 hours and 9 minutes, and it's only slightly longer than 1 hour and 27 minutes. So the proportions are completely wrong just because how the graphic form was chosen, the graphic form that was chosen to represent the data. So in this case, for instance, to make the graphic both attractive and also readable and clear, what I would think about doing would be just to straighten out the lines somehow. Look for a way to make the lines perfectly straight and parallel. That will pose challenges in terms of how displaying the data, but I would make the lines straight. And I believe that by doing that, some of the beauty that this graphic has, because it's certainly beautiful, would be sacrificed. But it needs to be sacrificed because you need to increase clarity and readability, right? And that is as I said before, one of the main balances that we need to strive to achieve whenever we design a visualization. And it's a hard one.
Alberto, a quick question. Actually, if you could go back to that slide that we were just looking at a minute ago.
Yeah.
With this particular visualization and kind of like the different pieces of data that we're reflecting on here, it looks like to me that like the main kind of determinant here is the fact that we're looking at a duration of time. And we're kind of measuring that duration of time starting, well, I guess it's starting in, I actually can't see it from my screen, it's too small, but
it's starting on the time at the times when the attacks happened. So time is measured from there. So it's not time measured according to an absolute measure of time beginning at the 12 p.m. thing and then continuing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's actually number of hours or number of minutes it took from the moment of the attacks.
So in that case, would reshuffling these countries in order to kind of reflect, a larger radius on the outside curve that was like a larger duration of time, would that be a solve for that, or would
I don't think so. I think that the solution in a case like this, I mean, I would need to make sketches myself in order to find perhaps a better way of representing the data. But I would recommend to either straighten out the lines and make them either vertical or horizontal and parallel, so you can actually compare them, or perhaps do a small circle for each one of the attacks or something. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, instead of a larger circle that gathers all of them together, do a small circular shape for each one of the attacks, for Brussels, for Lahore, for Istanbul, or for Iskandariyya. So 4 different circular graphics. But my main preference, and the first thing that I would try, would be to straighten out the lines, and only after use a circle, and then see which one of them works better.
Yeah, it's a great idea. One question that this brings to mind too is, for people who are less experienced with data visualization and maybe we're just kind of starting out, I think the habit is to just throw the kitchen sink at a visualization, get as much stuff in there, get as much data, make it as gorgeous as possible, so that when someone looks at it, they're like, wow, that's a really beautiful visualization. But then the actual data and the story is getting lost. Can you talk a little bit about like the kind of process that you approach a data visualization from, and when you're deciding to cover a particular story with a data visualization, what are some of the factors that you're thinking about to determine what form that visualization might take?
Yeah, well, there are several factors that contribute to that decision, how to shape the data. First of all, you need to take into account perceptual and cognitive issues. There is some science behind visualization. For example, there are papers written by people who actually study how readers perceive and read data visualization, and knowing a little bit about that kind of research can help you a little bit understanding and help you choosing when to use a line chart, when to use a bar graph, when to use a circular shape, etc., etc., etc. I mean, it would take forever to discuss these research, but there is actually, I open here, there is a blog post that was written recently by Kennedy Elliott, who works at the Washington Post. You can find it on Medium. It's titled 39 Studies About Human Perception in 30 Minutes. This is based on a talk that Kennedy gave at OpenVis conference, at the OpenVis conference, and she links to tons of research papers about visualization. So matters are not settled at all in terms of when to use certain kinds of graphics, but there are certain consensus in the visualization community about very basic issues, such as, for instance, that when you want people to actually be able to compare things with some sort of accuracy, it is better to use graphics that are based on common scales, vertical and horizontal, because those enable accurate comparisons or seeing actually accurate relationships accurately, relationships between data or variables, etc. So use graphics that are based on common scales. And the exception would be to use graphics that are not based on common scales. There may be reasons to do that, right? And there are certain kinds of graphics that obscure information just because they try to cram too much data into a small space. And there's a subjective decision to be made at some point when you take a look at your graphic and say, well, this is probably including too much information. The decision perhaps should be to split that information up into several smaller charts put side by side or put on top of each other. There is a common design strategy in visualization called small multiples. You can Google that because there are several articles out there that explain this approach to visualization, small multiples, that may help you clarify the information, the data a little bit better. And then, well, nothing really is more important in visualization, I believe, than creating multiple versions of the same graphic. So never stuck to the first solution that you find, right? You may begin, you may become fall in love with the first graphic that you design based on a data set, but the wisest thing to do is to actually create several versions of the same graphic using multiple graphic forms, and then compare them to each other and see which one of them you believe delivers the message or clarifies the information better. And if you can test those graphics with actual readers before you publish the graphic, even better. So that doing some testing before you publish can be also a great solution. In some cases, you cannot do it just because you don't have access to resources or to research groups to do that kind of testing, in which case you will need to trust your own judgment. But at least this recommendation stands. Don't stick to the first solution. Try to create several versions of the graphic and compare them to each other.
I think it's really, really good counsel. Those two links that you just recommended, I'll put those links to those references in the office hour as well. 39 studies about human perception on Medium, and then also some multiples.
Yeah, and there are other sources to find research about visualization. For example, Robert Kosara's website. Kosara is a researcher at Tableau, and he writes constantly about researching visualization. He's very active in the information visualization community, the research community. His website is eagereyes.org, eagereyes.org. And I'm actually going to open it up here and share my screen right now so people can see that website. It's an excellent resource for anybody interested in so it's eagereyes.org. Here it is, Eager Eyes. So there you go. That's the name of the website, .org. And great resource to find papers about visualization. He has written recently, by the way, about the EuroVis conference that happened recently, and he links to several very, very recent research papers.
That's great.
So one thing that I feel like you were touching on was that dataviz really does lend itself well to redesign, and that it's redesigning within the community is very powerful, and that it continually allows us to find better ways to look at data. I was wondering just, I guess, what your perception of redesign was, and it sounds like it's always better to continuously redesign because for something like a news article, you can't obviously like redesign and rewrite a news article, but within the community, it sounds like it lends itself very well to constantly be rethinking how to proceed.
All right. So there is a tradition in data visualization and information graphics of proposing redesigns for somebody else's work in a constructive manner, right? So, for instance, Fernanda Villegas and Martin Wattenberg, who work for Google doing visualization, a while ago they wrote an article about that. It's redesign, I believe, in visualization. Let me see if I can find it. Fernanda Villegas. And it's a wonderful reflection. No, here it is. It's also published on Medium. It's titled Design and Redesign in Data Visualization. And they actually talk about this tradition of constructive criticism and constructive redesign in data visualization. They stress the importance of being constructive because in the past we have found examples of destructive redesigns, meaning destructive criticism, saying basically, this graphic that this person has published is really, really bad, but then whoever wrote that article didn't really propose an alternative. And that is a very important thing to do, right? If you find a graphic that has, or you believe that it has room for improvement, if you want to engage in a constructive conversation with the original designer, you need to actually be, again, constructive and propose an alternative. So people out there, the audience, can compare the original graphic with the redesign and then engage in a conversation about which one of them is more appropriate. So this is what Fernanda and Martin wrote about, and they wrote about the importance of this tradition because it can help everybody, right? If you take one of my visualizations, for example, and you redesign it, first of all, I will be flattered, and if you give me sound recommendations on how to improve that graphic, I will be very thankful because that will improve my future work, right? It contributes to the knowledge, not just to my knowledge of visualization, or contributes to make me rethink my assumptions about visualization. But if you make that criticism, if it is constructive and positive, etc., and you make it public, it will contribute to everybody else's understanding on how to proceed and how to design a better graphic. So. And then obviously you need to be critical about your own work, right? So you take a look at it, if I take a look at my own graphics, right, graphics that I published 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, I always see things that I would like to improve, change, or rethink, or have more time to work on, etc. So it is important to have that in mind.
I think that's such an important point, Alberto, too. And I think in so much of the work that we do these days, we're kind of charting new territory in a lot of ways. Not just with data visualization, but with some of the other work that we're doing around immersive storytelling and VR and things like that. And a lot of times when I go into newsrooms, I think there's this discomfort with putting things out there that aren't perfect. And there's all of these constraints that we have upon us, like time, budget,
resources. Yeah,
all of these things.
And here's the thing. I mean, that for people who write books, for example, I know some people who have not published the book that they wrote just because they want that book to be perfect.
Right.
And they keep editing
Working
and
on it.
you're working on it. Well, there is some point in which you need to say, done. Or this is as good as it can get with the time that I have to write these. I need to just publish it. And if it has small errors or small mistakes, things like that, fine, you need to deal with that. I mean, there's no way to making anything absolutely perfect. So nothing. Everything has room for improvement, always room for improvement. So,
and that's another really great opportunity for engagement with your readers too. A lot of the newsrooms that I've talked to, they say that people give feedback. Yeah, exactly.
You receive feedback about things that could, and they can help you write a better thing next time. It applies also to visualization.
So Jen, what other examples do we have to talk about?
Yeah, I'd love to share. Let me share my screen. I'd love to share, given that today is an important vote in the UK today, I'd love to share some of the stuff that we did around the EU referendum and just some of the different ways that we thought about data for the EU referendum. I think one of the more simplistic ways that we first wanted to cut the data was looking at just search interest in leave versus stay. This one really shows, this is something that we often do where we're just looking at change over time and just a very simple line graph comparing the two. Another one, very similarly, another one that we just kind of wanted to, rather than seeing over time, we wanted to see this data geographically. And so if we actually look into this map right here, we can see search interest in different local authorities for where in the UK people are searching most for leave. So you can see kind of a heat map or a choropleth of density showing the areas where people are searching most for leave. So this is another way of looking at a very similar data set but cut in a different way. And this one might be a little bit more telling that in certain areas you're seeing more interest than in other areas. Another really interesting thing that we did, if we go back to our page, this was very much an experiment that we did. This was an interactive where we wanted to see what other people around the world were within the European Union were thinking about. The EU referendum, and you can see here if you toggle onto different countries, you can see the top questions for every single country. But one of the experiments that our team actually just released the other day was how this would look if we applied this to VR. And I can't show that part on my screen, but we actually just released a Medium post on how we turned that same visualization into a VR dataviz. You can see some of the images here and how we had to readapt it to a more immersive storytelling where when you put on the cardboard, kind of shifting your gaze so that you can see and hover over different countries. And so this was kind of a scrappier effort that we did to just see what it would mean to apply a dataviz to a VR experience.
And that's a very interesting experiment, I would say. And there's a lot of exploration to be made in how to include or use VR technologies in data visualization. It's still a completely open field, or it's the new Western frontier, right, to be explored.
Yeah, it sounds like there are very few dataviz that's been integrated into VR. I think the only one that I've also seen is the roller coaster looking at, I think it's like interest rates. So it sounds like it's a very new field that needs to be explored, and definitely excited to see what additional incorporations that we can do.
And test it, because we don't really know if those graphics are going to be effective or not. We don't know if people will read them, or it would find themselves feeling dizzy by immersing themselves. If they prefer static charts, 2D charts versus 3D interactive charts. So there's a lot of experiments to be made, I believe. And this is a great step in that direction.
And Jen, can we go back to that Brexit visualization? I just realized that we were looking at Alberto's screen instead of that one, and Molly was kind enough to let us know on the Hangout. So thank you, Molly, for your comment there.
Sure. Let me just scroll over a couple of these ones. This was the leave versus stay line graph that I mentioned. This is all also available on google.com/trends if you look on our carousel. And then this was actually the map that we had been chatting about, just showing the choropleth of searches for leave. If you go back to our page, we have a link at the top that shows our interactive here. that shows by country what the top questions were around the referendum. So you can click onto a country, and you'll see what they were most concerned about in Finland around the EU referendum. And then if you check out our Medium account at Google News Lab, we just released a Medium post about how to make a VR data viz. And it talks about some of the learnings that we had in incorporating this viz into a VR experience. So here's a little image of what it would look like on a VR experience.
Yeah, I would also just use this as an example too, just kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier about getting something out the door, even if it's not perfect, even if you don't have a script already written for like how things should be done. There hasn't been a ton of visualizations that have been done in VR yet, and if there have been, please send them our way because we're really looking to collect as many examples as possible. But even just kind of experimenting around with this, and I think this idea we spun up, and Jen, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we spun up this idea within a couple weeks. Or even probably a shorter time frame than that. And it really just started from a conversation about like, hey, what if? Like what if we try to do this in VR? Or, like, would this work? And we really honestly didn't know if it would work or not. I think there's a lot of iterations that we went through that we realized actually this can really make people nauseous, if we're not careful. But I think the point of this is that it was an experiment, and it was an exercise in determining the viability of a particular type of visualization to help tell that story. And I would just encourage any newsroom or journalist, as you're kind of moving into these new realms of data visualization or augmented reality or virtual reality, to think about that as like, a playground or as an experiment. There's this amazing community of people available online now that, as Alberto said, will give feedback and will give guidance. And, I think that that's one of the most important parts about all of this is sharing that knowledge, because these rules haven't necessarily been written yet, especially when we're talking about virtual reality. There's a great legacy of data journalism guidance and how to create really great visualizations, but once you start thinking about those in a virtual space, suddenly all of those norms, just like with filmmaking, you don't have that same frame, so that interaction changes.
There's actually another area that needs a lot more research and a lot of more work and experimentation, and that may be even much more useful than virtual reality. I think that virtual reality is fantastic. We should explore it. There are great things to be seen from that field. But for me, if I needed to focus just on one thing today, and to invest resources and research people and time, etc., would be on a mobile application. So how to make all these very complex data visualizations work on the mobile platform, because everybody who's working in this business today knows that it is hard, because in the past most people access internet content through the computer. On a computer you have a relatively large screen, 13 inches, 15 inches, 17, even 21 inches like I have here at home, or two screens. I have two screens. That's also why my face moved like that, because I'm working with two screens simultaneously. Well, in mobile you work with this size, so how do you adapt that desktop application onto the mobile application, transform into a mobile application? And there's a lot of work to be done in that field. I don't have big answers to that question. How to adapt, not how to adapt the big graphic to the smaller screen, but how to reproduce the rich experience that you had in the past on the desktop platform on a mobile platform. And that's a huge challenge, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even just from a navigational standpoint, like I think one of the things that we encounter quite a bit is, if let's say, for example, somebody embeds a graphic or a data visualization or a map into a mobile experience, and you're scrolling with your thumb, and suddenly you hit that iframe, and then you're stuck within that iframe, moving the actual visualization.
There's a lot of UX questions and structural questions and navigational questions and presentation questions, like what is the right amount of data that you can present in a graphic that is so small, right? And how to make it at the same time, as I said before, clear, beautiful, elegant, and deep enough, right? So there's a lot of experimentation to be done here. VR certainly is something that we need to experiment with, but VR is a little bit too far ahead for many people who should be focusing more, I believe, on improving the experience on mobile platforms instead. I would say first.
I think what's really interesting about that is just being able to experiment and then finding what hypotheses or what results you might get and sharing it with the community. And that's something that Simon Rogers on our team, our data editor, really tried to bring through with his Medium post, just talking about some of the things that we learned as we experimented with a VR dataviz, from seeing how much data we could actually incorporate into a dataviz, and how we did have to distill it into just the core components, or things like the perspective and the frame of reference, and looking up versus down to try and make sure people didn't get sick while looking at our dataviz. And so it really is important to be able to share those insights as we do experiment into
exactly. Write like a postmortem. Postmortem every time that you do a large experiment like that. Something that's important to, I believe, first of all, disclose your sources. That's also important when you do a visualization. Create your sources, saying where the data come from, explain the methodology behind the graphic, and then actually write about it. Write about your experiences. Things that you believe you got right, things that you believe could have gone better, things that are just an open question, and open the debate, right? So everybody can engage in that conversation.
Really cool.
So Jen, what else do we have we could show today?
Yeah, so I'd love to share another dataviz that our team worked on, and just show kind of how we thought about as we redesigned it from one to another. This was something that we put out back when we had 6 different candidates in the Democratic Party. What this was looking at was when you search for one specific candidate, how people then search for another candidate, and who that next candidate was. So if you hovered over Hillary Clinton, the next candidate that people searched for in Google was Bernie Sanders, Lincoln Chafee, and so on. And then you could kind of scroll over varying candidates and see how people were aligned with other candidates as they went along. So with Lincoln Chafee, the next person I think was, we look for the number 1, was Bernie Sanders, and then next was Jim Webb. And you could kind of scroll over and just see how it was aligned differently as depending on which candidate you're interested in. What was really great about this was it was definitely very aesthetic. It was very visually fun to kind of scroll through the different colors. But what we found was that people had a hard time reading this and kind of understanding what this visualization was, even though it was very aesthetic. So the functionality of it was, and the readability of it was hard to process.
Well, it's a core diagram, and a core diagram is still a quite unusual graphic form. Many people still don't know how to read it correctly. This is a challenge that we have faced in the past with in many situations. For example, think about the scatter plot. Scatter plot is a common way of representing the relationship between 2 quantitative variables, one on the x-axis and one on the y-axis, right? And I would say that 20 years ago, not many people knew how to read a scatter plot, but today you see scatter plots in the media. Actually, the Pew Research Center a while ago did a little bit of a survey about scientific knowledge, and discovered that around 60-something% of the readers know how to use how to read a scatter plot. And they frame. I'm actually going to share this in just for a second, because that's an important, I believe, article. Let me see if I can find it. Pew Research scatter plot, and I believe that the actual figure was 63%. So 63.
Good memory.
Yeah, well, I have good memory about this article because I wrote about it. Because the Pew Research Center framed the results of this little experiment that they made as only 63% of American adults can correctly read this chart, right? That's how most people read it. Only 63%. And I said, well, it is not only. I mean, you should not frame this as a negative result. I would say, wow, 63% of Americans can read a scatter plot. That's fantastic, because that didn't happen 20 years ago. I would say 20 years ago, I didn't know how to use a scatter plot myself, and because I had never seen it published in the media, right? So my recommendation on Twitter a while ago was to say, whoa, right, this is great. And actually, the Pew Research Center interviewed me for these, and I made exactly that point, that for me, this is great news, that more than half of Americans across age groups and across educational levels, etc., can read a scatter plot correctly. And if you go to college-educated Americans, the percentage is huge. It's like 80-something%. That's fantastic, right? Well, there's something similar may happen with unusual graphic forms like the chord diagram. Most people cannot read it correctly nowadays because it's not common in the media. But visualization has a grammar, has a vocabulary, and that vocabulary can be learned. let me see if I can. Okay, sorry about that. I was just trying to de-share my screen. So yeah, visualization has a grammar and it has a vocabulary, and that needs to be learned. I mean, in kindergarten, our kids are taught how to read bar charts and histograms, etc. Before they are taught that, they don't know how to use a bar chart. They don't know that the height of the bar corresponds to a number. They need to be taught that. They need to be taught how to read the chart, right? With the problem with the chord diagram and other very unusual graphic forms, such as, I don't know, the parallel coordinates, which is an extraordinary solution for showing multidimensional data. But it is not common. Therefore, a high majority of people don't know how to read a parallel coordinate chart or a chord diagram. But that should not make us refrain from using those graphic forms. What we should do is, if we want to use that graphic form, because we believe that is the best way for representing the data, is to use the graphic form and add perhaps an annotation explaining how to read the chart. And this is something that has been done in the past. Let me show another example. So the head of the news application team at ProPublica, Scott Klein, is writing a series of articles about historical visualizations. Let me just find the first one that he published. So you can find a series of articles linked from this article that I'm showing on the screen right now. So this is the first one that he published in the series. So Scott is writing about visualizations, infographics, charts that were published in American newspapers in the 19th century. And the first one that he wrote about was this line chart that you have over here of cases of cholera in New York in 1849 or something like that, right? It's a regular time series chart, right? Everybody knows how to read these. So this is the total weekly deaths, this is the weekly deaths by cholera. Everybody nowadays knows that the higher the line, the more cases of cholera. But we know that today, because the line chart is a very common kind of graphic form, right? Everybody learns how to read a line chart like this, a time series chart. But in the middle of the 19th century, not many people knew how to read a statistical chart. Therefore, what the authors of this graphic did was, right underneath the chart, they wrote how to read the chart. The above chart represents the number of victims, blah, blah, blah. As you notice, the line varies in height, blah, blah, blah. The higher it goes, the more. So they actually explain, they actually work how to read the chart. So the next time that readers of this newspaper faced a time series chart, they didn't need this explanation anymore. They already grasped the grammar. They already grasped the vocabulary behind this graphic, right? So this is something that we need to, I believe, apply or think about whenever we do an uncommon visualization, such as a chord diagram. Should we refrain from using chord diagrams? Well, perhaps not. Perhaps we should keep using it, but explain how to read it. Right? Now, the alternative version that you made for that, which I saw, could also work. So let's take a look at that. I interrupted you. Sorry, I get carried away.
No, I think what's really interesting is that the framework of thinking of data visualization is both exploratory and explanatory. So you're both teaching people how to read these as well as sharing with them what the data looks like.
Exactly. So let's take a look at the alternative.
Let's see. So let me share my screen. So what we ended up doing, this was a different set of data, but in concept it was very similar. The idea here was looking at Super Tuesday and showing for each candidate who the next candidate was that people often search for in Google. So here you could click on Donald Trump, and you can see the ranked order of who was being searched for next. Then click on Marco Rubio and see who the next ones were for him. Here, I think we would call this a tree diagram, if I'm correct, but the idea was to simplify it a little bit more so that we could see, for example, the rankings right here. It would be a lot easier to kind of navigate and understand what the insights were rather than on the original chord diagram, where it was a little bit harder to go around and see what was the darkest line here and to distill the insights in this case.
What we lose, though, on the redesign that you made is a sense of proportion, I believe. I think that the outlines of the circles are proportional to the number of searches, right? So the thicker the line that surrounds each picture is proportional to the number of searches? Or
no, not quite, no. So in this case, we just wanted to show the ordering. So it doesn't, you're right, it doesn't show the magnitude, whereas here
what I would do would be, go back to the redesign just for a second. One thing that is worth trying in this case is, for instance, in this case, to make the lines that connect the current candidate to the other candidates thicker or thinner according to the number of searches that follow the original search, right? So just basically applying the same idea the core diagram is based on, right?
Mm-hmm.
The thickness of the line is proportional to the number of searches. You can also apply this principle to this visualization, just changing the weight, changing the thickness of those lines.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, because then it can kind of show who is most linked to another candidate.
Yeah, because if you only show rank data 1, 2, 3, 4, you don't get a sense of how far these things are from each other. It may happen that the first candidate only had, a couple of searches more than the second candidate, but the difference could be thousands and thousands of searches. We don't know unless that you show that proportion, right?
Yeah, it very much does depend on. It's almost as if we have a lot more data that we're sharing within this visualization, whereas in this one we kind of distilled it and broke it down to just the ranks. So definitely having these thicker, bolder lines could really add in that additional layer to help people read through it.
And another thing that I would do would be to make, so you have animated transitions. So whenever you click on a candidate, you first of all have that candidate center, and then the branches expand from that candidate. But I think that's something that I would do here. I don't know if that will improve understanding, but it certainly would look better, I think. So let's say, for example, that you are on that view right now, and you click on Marco Rubio. Click on Marco Rubio now. Rather than making the visualization disappear completely and then appear again, what you could do is to move Marco Rubio from where he was to that position, and then everything branches out from there, right? I think that can, so you click on Marco Rubio, and Marco Rubio will move to the left, right? To the left.
Yeah, rather than disappear and
rather than just disappearing, yes. That's another thing that perhaps would improve this graphic. But I like this visualization. I think that it's fun and it's very readable.
Really cool. Cool.
I just realized I was muted. Sorry. Just a point that I want to bring up too, like as we're going through some of these visualizations. So if someone is interested in using Google Trends data, for example, as some of these examples that we're looking at are based off of, how would they go about taking a trends search or a trends query, getting that data out in a format that is useful, and then creating a visualization similar to what we're looking at? Because I think a lot of times what I hear from people is like, well, these are great, these visualizations are really sexy, they're really beautiful, but we don't have the developer resources, we don't have the artistic resources to do that. Maybe we could build some stepping stones for folks to go from the embeddable Google Trends visualizations that are built in within the platform, and then kind of charting a path to like the type of visualizations that we're talking about here.
Yeah, so I want to share one example. This was from the Washington Post discussing how brunch became a very popular meal in America. What was really great about this article was it really did leverage all of the data that we had on our Explore page. So you can see here, it first starts off by just showing Google search interest in brunch over time. This is data that, our page. This is data that you can pull directly from our Explore page. So if you were to type in brunch, you would immediately get a report that shows the search interest over time for brunch. So they were able to get essentially make this type of line graph and download this data and make this very first visual. Then they looked at it from another direction by looking at search interest by region, and then also showing census data, which I thought was an interesting additional component to show density of where people are searching for brunch versus what's the breakdown of people living in those areas. And this very first map is data that you could get from this if we filter this to look at just the US, you would then be able to see that very same heat map of sorts at the very top of our page. So what was really great about this was it utilized data directly from our Explore page, and it didn't need to be a very complicated or dataviz, but it was able to just add in additional components by adding in other layers of data like US Census data. And then also just to share, if you wanted to download this data, you would just need to click on the top right, and you could download everything on this page as a CSV, and you'd be able to incorporate it into another data visualizer of your choice.
Excellent. And you can create something like that with Google tools and many other tools. I mean, the tools that I use, for example, in my own work are, I would not say mostly, but at great extent, open source tools, right? So there is, for example, the R programming language, which is an excellent open source language for statistical presentation. It has a wonderful library called ggplot2 to depict data. It's easy to learn, relatively easy to learn. And there is an R extension called Shiny that allows you to create interactive graphics. Many people out there are also using JavaScript as the language of choice to make visualization, and particularly a library called D3 to create interactive graphics. It's more or less becoming the standard nowadays in data visualization, although myself I find it a little bit difficult. Therefore, I try to stay with R. Yeah, I tend to stick to R. I find the R language much friendlier and easy to use, although it's not that appropriate for web applications. But Google also has certain tools that you can use to depict those data, right?
Yeah, and I think being able to just visualize it on Google Charts, I think that's a really great first step in just seeing a lot of the basic ways to visualize the data.
Yeah.
Next week, also at our office hours, just to highlight this, we will be talking about other tools that we can. Oh, hi.
That's my daughter. She just woke up. She just joined the conversation.
A future data visualizer.
Yeah, exactly.
So next week we'll be talking about specific tools that you can use to integrate with Google Trends data to experiment how you might want to visualize, whether it's data wrapper or fusion tables.
Data wrappers and a great option. Yeah.
And so a lot of these open source tools that you can utilize and leverage to visualize your data if you aren't comfortable with using a language like R or JavaScript.
Great. Fantastic.
Yeah, and we'll be, again, next week, we'll be going much deeper into a lot of these. There's also training materials that we're going to be putting together, in the next several months around this concept around data visualization. So on the g.co/newslab site, part of the reason we do office hours like this is to gather information, to gather input from people, to figure out, what, as Alberto was saying, what are the industry standards that people are using, and then, how do we, as storytellers, take advantage of these tools in a way that's really useful using Google data. So, in addition to sharing the links of some of the things that Alberto was mentioning, like R and D3 and these other data visualization tools, we'll be posting the links to those in the description, and we'll be bringing those up again next week when we talk with Frank Bai in a little bit more detail about this as well.
That sounds great.
So we've only got about 4 minutes left before the end of this office hour. Jen, do you have any last minute things that you wanted to kind of share and kind of tee up for next week? And then Alberto, I'll turn back to you, and maybe if you have some specific new things that you're working on that you'd like to talk about, and kind of point people in the direction of some resources to find out more about the work that you do and kind of like how you're thinking about data visualization. I think that'd be a great way to wrap up.
Yeah, I'd love to just share two last things with our audience. One is that, excuse me, we have a Google Trends data store where we have much more in-depth data sets. A lot of these data sets are ones that we have incorporated into our visualizations. Often when we make a visualization, we'd love to hear how other people might redesign it. And so we often will upload our data sets here and would love to even be tweeted at if you are able to make another visualization that's similar to ours. One example is that we, a couple months back, had posted data showing search interest in every single presidential candidate over time. And as a result of posting that on our GitHub, we saw, let's see if I can, there's actually a different example. There's issues data, but we found someone in the community who actually developed one of these horse races based on the data that we had posted. And what was really amazing about that was this was one of the first horse races our team actually saw, and we've now been able to leverage using horse races for a lot of our real-time events like presidential debates or the upcoming conventions or even today's Brexit referendum. And so we love providing these open data sets to the community and just seeing what people are able to come up with it. And so we definitely encourage you to let us know if you're ever able to kind of redesign any of our work and share it with us.
And actually, Jen, to that note, like, what are the best ways that people can share that type of information with us? I think there's a few different ways that people can get in touch.
Yeah, I think the best way is if you're on Twitter to tweet out to us at Google Trends. We also have a News Lab Twitter handle, and that's at Google News Lab. Those would we constantly have people on our team monitoring both Twitter handles, and so definitely, and also we're also very active on Twitter within our personal handles. So if you tweet any work that you might have done or any data that you might have played with on our GitHub, definitely feel free to tweet at either handle, and we'll definitely see it.
Yeah, and I think, for those of you who might not be on Twitter, there's also our YouTube channel, there's a Google Plus channel, so feel free to reach out to us that way. And then failing all of that, we also have our email address, newslabsupport@google.com. And I get a lot of comments and just random links from people that will share. They say, hey, look, we created this really great visualization, or we created this really great VR project using your tools. What do you think? And we love that. I mean,
Yeah.
I think especially when we can reshare those examples, we can give a little bit of context to it. If nothing else, that's one thing that we can do really, really well is uplift and share other people's great work to kind of highlight the types of work that are being done in this field. So Alberto, or Jen, did you have anything else you wanted to touch on before we turn to Alberto and then wrap up?
I think that's it on my end. Alberto, do you have any, last minute best piece of advice for anyone that's starting off in data visualization?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually quite simple. I mean, take a look at the resources that are going to be posted, particularly the blogs that write about visualization, just to get a grasp of some of the most elementary but also really important principles of how to represent data visually. Take a look at a couple of books. Fortunately, nowadays there's tons of very good books about visualization out there. That is something that has changed quite a lot in the past couple of decades. There's a lot of very recent books that are extremely good to get started in visualization. So get a couple of them, try to read them, and then just start practicing with some of the tools that we have mentioned. Right? It doesn't need to be all of them. It's impossible to learn how to use R and JavaScript and Google tools and whatever else you want to use. All of that simultaneously. Just choose one of them, stick to it for a while, and just start using it to create real-world projects. So download some data from Google Trends or from whatever other public sources out there. You can just download data from the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or whatever. Just download some data and see what you can come up with. Start creating projects about topics that you care about. That is the most important thing. Think about topics that you really care about. I don't know, poverty, sports, income inequality. I don't know, whatever it is that that makes that gets you interested when you're reading the news, or something that is really related to your interests, and download data related to that and start doing visualization projects around that. That's the best way to start.
That sounds so good.
Yeah.
Alberto, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a really informative office hour, and I hope our viewers also feel the same. We'll be posting, as I mentioned before, links to all of the examples that we mentioned in the description of this office hour, both on YouTube and Google+, as well as links to Alberto's books and a couple other resources that we mentioned during the session today. If anybody has additional questions, as always, feel free to drop your questions and comments in the comment section below. We'll be following back up next Thursday at 7:30 a.m. Pacific time with Jen, as well as Frank Bai, who will be joining us to talk a little bit about other Google tools. And hopefully by then I have a new laptop where I can actually use my camera without the Hangout crashing. So again, thank you for everybody for joining. Visit our website, g.co/newslab, where you'll find lessons and tutorials on how to use a lot of Google's tools. Check us out on Twitter at Google News Lab, at Google Trends. And Alberto, what is the best way for people to reach you if they have questions, comments, or want to share work that they're doing as well?
Through my website, through my Twitter handle, and through my email address, which can be easily found in my website. So if you just Google your name, the first result will be in my website. There is a contact link there where you can contact me.
So look it up on Google search. Always a good place to start.
Always Google it. Yeah, just to begin with.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, everybody. Have yourselves a great afternoon, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.